Racist judge humiliated her in court. Seconds later, the truth ended his career. The courtroom fell silent except for one sound, Magistrate Brian Lawson's laughter. It wasn't polite amusement. It was the kind of theatrical, head-thrown-back laughter designed to humiliate. His gavel hand slapped the bench as he struggled to compose himself, black robes shifting as his shoulders shook. "Ms. Miller," he finally managed, wiping at his eyes, "perhaps, and I say this with all due respect, perhaps you should consider enrolling in a community college paralegal program before attempting to practice law in my courtroom." The woman in the cream-colored suit didn't flinch. Jessica Miller sat perfectly still at the defendant's table, her hands clasped in front of her, her silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun. Around her, the courtroom audience shifted uncomfortably. Someone in the back row had their phone out, recording. The court reporter's fingers had frozen above her stenotype. "This is how actual jurisprudence works, Ms. Miller," Lawson continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "Not whatever creative interpretation you've presented here today." Jessica reached for the small leather-bound notebook beside her legal pad. She opened it with practiced precision, clicked her pen, and began to write. The scratching of pen on paper was the only sound in the courtroom. Lawson's smile widened. He mistook her silence for defeat. He had no idea that she was still moving her pen. The same pen she'd used 3 years ago to sign his judicial appointment recommendation. The contrast was deliberate. On one side of the courtroom, Magistrate Brian Lawson, elevated on his bench, draped in the authority of black robes, a graduate of a prestigious law school, armed with the power to imprison, to fine, to destroy lives with the strike of a gavel. On the other side, Jessica Miller, seated at a scarred wooden table, dressed in an ordinary suit from a department store, her legal documents organized in simple folders rather than expensive leather binders, appearing for all the world like a woman in over her head. But there were details that didn't quite fit the narrative Lawson had constructed. The way Jessica's eyes tracked every word that left his mouth, cataloging, categorizing, filing away for future reference. The way her pen moved across that leather notebook, not frantically, not emotionally, but with the methodical precision of someone who had done this before. Many times before. The way her lips curved into the faintest smile when Lawson mentioned his impeccable judicial record and his 12 years of distinguished legal practice. 12 years. She'd been on the bench for 32. Jessica had seen the inside of hundreds of courtrooms in her career. Federal courtrooms, appellate chambers, conference rooms where judicial candidates were evaluated and appointed. But she had never seen them from this angle, from the defendant's chair, where the marble columns looked like prison bars and the seal of justice on the wall felt like a cruel joke. This was her experiment. Her test. Her journey to the other side of the bench. And Magistrate Brian Lawson, in his arrogance, in his assumption that a black woman in a modest suit couldn't possibly understand the law, had just made the most catastrophic mistake of his career. He'd confused her silence for weakness. He'd mistaken her observation for ignorance. He'd seen her leather notebook and thought it was the desperate record-keeping of an amateur, not recognizing it as the same notebook she carried to Judicial Qualifications Commission hearings. The same notebook where she'd once written, "Brian Lawson, demonstrates strong legal acumen and commitment to judicial integrity. Recommend for appointment." That was 3 years ago. Now, she was writing something different. 10:47 a.m. Magistrate Lawson openly mocks defendant's legal knowledge in open court, makes assumptions about defendant's education level based on race. Courtroom atmosphere hostile. Procedural violations noted, denied motion without reading full brief, refused defendant's request for continuance despite proper notice. The pen kept moving. And Magistrate Lawson kept laughing, completely unaware that the woman he was humiliating held his entire career in her hands. Jessica closed her notebook and looked up at the man on the bench. Their eyes met for just a moment. She smiled. It was the smile of someone who knows exactly how this story ends. 3 weeks earlier, the envelope had arrived at Jessica's chambers on a Tuesday morning. Her clerk had placed it on her desk with the rest of the mail, not knowing that this particular envelope would change everything. Jessica slid it open with her letter opener, expecting another fundraising appeal or conference invitation. Instead, she found a civil complaint naming her as defendant in a property dispute case. The claim was absurd, a neighbor alleging she'd damaged his fence during a renovation that had never happened. The documentation was sloppy, the legal theory was nonsense, and the whole thing reeked of harassment. But it was the venue that caught her attention, Briarwood County Court. Magistrate Brian Lawson presiding. She'd heard whispers about that courtroom. Quiet conversations between colleagues at judicial conferences, carefully worded complaints from civil rights attorneys, statistical anomalies in sentencing data that no one seemed willing to investigate formally. Lawson had a reputation, but he was protected by the old boys network, by political connections, by the assumption that accusations of bias were simply sour grapes from losing attorneys. Jessica stood at her office window, looking out at the federal courthouse plaza below. Attorneys in expensive suits rushed between buildings, carrying briefcases full of motions and briefs. How many of them, she wondered, understood what justice looked like for people who couldn't afford those suits? For people who walked into courtrooms without law degrees, without connections, without the armor of institutional respect. She'd spent 32 years on the bench believing the system worked. That the law was blind. That justice was impartial. It was time to find out if that was true. Jessica sat down at her desk and drafted a simple response to the complaint. No letterhead from the Federal Appeals Court. No mention of her title. Just, Jessica Miller, pro se, at the top of the page. She would appear in Lawson's courtroom as herself, not as Judge Miller, not as a federal appointee, but as an ordinary black woman seeking justice. She wanted to see the system from the other side of the bench. She had a feeling she wouldn't like what she found. The motion had taken Jessica 3 hours to write. She'd cited relevant case law, included properly formatted exhibits, and followed every procedural rule to the letter. It was a simple motion to dismiss based on lack of evidence, the kind of motion any first-year law student could draft competently. She'd filed it 2 weeks before the hearing, giving Lawson's clerk plenty of time to add it to the docket. Now she sat in the courtroom, watching Magistrate Lawson work his way through the morning's calendar. The pattern was impossible to miss once you knew to look for it. When Thomas Henderson, a white plaintiff in a contract dispute, approached the bench, Lawson leaned forward with interest. "Mr. Henderson, I've read your motion carefully. Very thorough work. Walk me through your reasoning on the liability question." The hearing lasted 23 minutes. Lawson asked thoughtful questions, gave Henderson time to elaborate, and ultimately granted the motion with detailed reasoning from the bench. When Maria Santos, a black defendant in a small claims case, presented her evidence, Lawson barely glanced up from his phone. Motion denied. Next case. 45 seconds, start to finish. Jessica's turn came just before the lunch break. She stood, carrying her carefully prepared motion to the bench. Lawson took it from her hand without making eye contact. She watched him scan the first page. His eyes never moved to the second page. Never looked at her citations. Never examined her exhibits. He reached for his stamp, the red one that read, "Denied," and brought it down on the first page with decisive force. Motion denied. Lacks legal merit. He was already looking past her to the next case. Next. Your Honor, if I could just direct your attention to the precedent cited on page. Ms. Miller. His voice was sharp. I've made my ruling. Please sit down so we can move through the calendar efficiently. Jessica remained standing for one more moment, watching him. He still wasn't looking at her. Wasn't seeing her. That was the problem. She returned to her seat and opened her leather notebook. Her pen moved across the page, recording every detail. The time stamps. The disparate treatment. The motion denied without review. The scales of justice, she was learning, had been weighted long before she'd walked through the courthouse doors. Jessica arrived at the courthouse at 8 in the morning, an hour before her scheduled hearing. She wanted to review her filed exhibits one more time, to make sure everything was in order. The clerk's office was already busy, a line of attorneys and litigants waiting at the counter. Jessica took her place in line, watching the interactions ahead of her. Marcus Trent, the senior clerk, was working the counter. When a white attorney in a Brooks Brothers suit approached, Trent smiled broadly. "Mr. Davidson, good to see you. I've got your filing right here. I took the liberty of checking the exhibits against your index, and I noticed you were missing a signature on Exhibit C. I made a note for you so you can correct it before the hearing." Davidson thanked him profusely. When Jessica reached the counter, Trent's smile vanished. "Yes. I'm here to review my filed exhibits for the Miller vs. Cunningham case. I filed them last week with the motion for summary judgment." Trent turned to his computer, typing slowly. "Case number?" Jessica provided it. Watched him scroll through records. "No exhibits on file for that case." "That's impossible. I filed them personally. I have the certified mail receipt." "Then your mail must have gotten lost." He was already looking past her to the next person in line. "Next." "Wait," Jessica pulled the receipt from her folder, the green certified mail card with Marcus Trent's signature clearly visible. "This is your signature. You signed for the package." Trent glanced at it for half a second. "That's not my signature." "Next." Behind her, a white woman in yoga pants approached with a stack of papers. "Excuse me, I'm not sure if I filled out this form correctly." Trent's smile returned like someone had flipped a switch. "Of course, let me take a look." He took the woman's papers, pulled out a pen, and began walking her through each section with patience and care. Jessica stood to the side, watching. The woman was filing a small claims complaint and clearly had never been to court before. Trent spent 15 minutes helping her, explaining procedures, even recommending which exhibits would strengthen her case. When the woman finally left, grateful and prepared, Jessica tried again. "Mr. Trent, I'd like to request a hearing on the missing exhibits." "No records, no hearing. File them again if you want." He turned away, shuffling papers. Jessica opened her notebook. Added Marcus Trent's name to her growing list. Documented the certified mail receipt, the signature, the witness who'd seen the entire exchange. The documents hadn't gotten lost. They'd been disappeared. The courtroom was fuller than usual. Word had spread, somehow, that Magistrate Lawson's morning calendar would be entertaining. Jessica spotted 2 law students in the back row, notebooks open. A local reporter she recognized from civil rights coverage. Even a few attorneys who had no cases scheduled but had apparently decided to observe. Lawson was performing today. "Ms. Miller," he began, holding up her brief with 2 fingers like it was contaminated, "I have to say, this is certainly creative." Laughter rippled through the courtroom. He was playing to the audience now, his voice carrying theatrical amusement. "Your interpretation of Johnson versus State is particularly imaginative. Tell me, did you actually read the case, or are you relying on some internet summary?" Jessica kept her voice level. "Your Honor, if you turn to page 7 of my brief, you'll see the full citation and the relevant passage." "Oh, I've read it." He waved dismissively. "The question is whether you understood what you read." The Johnson court was addressing criminal procedure, not civil liability. "With respect, Your Honor, Johnson established a broader principle about evidentiary standards that—" "Ms. Miller." He leaned back in his chair, making a show of patience. "Let me ask you something. Did you write this brief yourself?" The courtroom went silent. Jessica felt every eye turn to her. "Yes, Your Honor." "Really?" His eyebrows rose in exaggerated surprise. "Because this reads like someone tried to string together legal-sounding phrases without understanding what they mean." "Are you sure you didn't have help? A law student friend, perhaps?" "Someone from a let's say, more traditional legal background. The implication hung in the air, toxic and unmistakable. Jessica heard someone in the gallery inhale sharply. "I wrote every word, Your Honor." "Well." Lawson set down the brief with a theatrical sigh. "Then I'm afraid you're simply in over your head in a real courtroom, Ms. Miller. This isn't traffic court. This isn't small claims. This is a court of law where actual jurisprudence matters." He stamped her motion denied without another glance. Next case. Jessica returned to her seat, her face burning, her heart pounding. But her hands were steady as she opened her leather notebook. She wrote down every word. Every implication. Every laugh from the audience. Lawson thought he was humiliating her. He had no idea he was testifying against himself. The email arrived at 4:47 p.m. on a Friday. Jessica was in her chambers, preparing for a complex appellate hearing, when her personal phone buzzed. Notice of emergency motion, read the subject line. Assistant District Attorney Victoria Brennan had filed an emergency motion requesting immediate sanctions against Jessica, claiming she'd made frivolous and vexatious filings that wasted the court's time. The motion was filled with inflammatory language, deliberate abuse of process, pattern of misconduct, contempt for judicial authority. The hearing was scheduled for Monday at 9 a.m. Jessica checked the timestamp. Filed at 4:43 p.m. She'd received notice at 4:47 p.m. That gave her exactly 64 hours, including a weekend, to prepare a response. Court rules required 72 hours notice for emergency motions unless actual emergency circumstances existed. A property dispute with no imminent harm didn't qualify. But that wasn't the worst part. Monday morning, Jessica arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early. She'd spent the weekend crafting her response, documenting how none of her filings met the legal definition of frivolous, how Brennan's motion itself violated procedural rules. She approached the clerk's desk to file her response. "Hearing's been moved to courtroom 2, Marcus Trent said without looking up. "Judge already ruled." Jessica froze. "I'm sorry, what?" Magistrate Lawson issued his order at 8:15 this morning. Before the scheduled hearing time. Here. He slid a paper across the counter. Jessica picked it up, her hands trembling slightly as she read. Lawson had granted every request in Brennan's motion. Imposed sanctions. Ordered Jessica to pay court costs. Declared her previous motions frivolous. All before she'd had a chance to present her response. All before the scheduled hearing time. "This is a violation of due process," Jessica said quietly. "I'm entitled to be heard." Trent shrugged. "You can appeal if you want." Jessica looked down at the order, at Lawson's signature scrawled across the bottom. Behind her, she heard Victoria Brennan's heels clicking against the marble floor, heard her satisfied laugh as she spoke with another prosecutor. The system wasn't broken by accident. It was working exactly as designed, just not for everyone. Jessica photographed the order, time-stamped the email, documented the procedural violations. The leather notebook was filling up fast now, page after page of constitutional violations dressed up as judicial rulings. She was gathering evidence. And they had no idea. Officer Raymond Cole took the stand with the confident swagger of a man who'd testified hundreds of times. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the courtroom lights. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down with a slight smile. Victoria Brennan walked him through his testimony. According to Cole, he'd personally witnessed Jessica engaging in aggressive behavior toward her neighbor on 3 separate occasions. He described incidents in vivid detail, the dates, times, and exact nature of the alleged confrontations. Jessica listened, her pen moving steadily across her notebook. Cole was describing events that had never happened. She'd been in federal court, presiding over trials, on 2 of the 3 dates he mentioned. The 3rd date had been a Saturday when she'd been in another state entirely, giving a keynote address at a legal conference. When it was her turn to cross-examine, Jessica stood and pulled out 3 documents from her folder. "Officer Cole, you testified that on September 14th at approximately 2 p.m., you witnessed me having a confrontation with my neighbor. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "I'd like to enter into evidence this transcript from the Federal District Court, showing that I was presiding over a trial that afternoon. The record shows I was on the bench from 1:30 p.m. until 5:15 p.m. She handed the document to the clerk. Lawson barely glanced at it. "Objection sustained." Jessica blinked. "Your Honor, no objection was made. The document is inadmissible. Improper foundation." He waved his hand dismissively. "Continue with your questions, Ms. Miller, or sit down." Jessica pulled out the second document. "Your Honor, this is a signed affidavit from the conference organizers in Atlanta, confirming my presence on October 3rd, the second date Officer Cole mentioned. Also inadmissible. Hearsay. It's an affidavit, Your Honor. It falls under the business records exception. Ms. Miller, I've made my ruling. Do you have any actual questions for the officer, or are you going to continue wasting the court's time with irrelevant paperwork?" Jessica looked at Officer Cole. He was leaning back in the witness chair, completely relaxed. He knew Lawson would protect him. "No further questions, Your Honor." Cole stepped down, his testimony unchallenged, his lies now part of the official record. Jessica added his name to her list. Documented the evidence Lawson had excluded, the testimonies he'd accepted without scrutiny, the pattern that was now impossible to ignore. The system protected its own. But she was part of a different system. And that system had rules too. The bond hearing should have been routine. The underlying case was a property dispute, no criminal charges, no flight risk, no danger to the community. In similar cases, Lawson typically set bonds between $1,000 and $2,500. Jessica stood before the bench, waiting for his ruling. Bond is set at $10,000, cash only. Lawson brought down his gavel with finality. The courtroom went silent. Even Victoria Brennan looked surprised. "Your Honor," Jessica said carefully, "that's 4 times the standard bond for this type of case. I'd like to request reconsideration based on." Request denied. Next case. That evening, Jessica sat in her study at home, surrounded by printouts. She'd requested public records from the clerk's office that afternoon, bond decisions from Lawson's courtroom for the past 3 years. 847 cases total. She organized them by defendant race, type of case, and bond amount. Then she ran the numbers. The pattern was undeniable. For property disputes like hers, white defendants received an average bond of $2,100. Black defendants received an average bond of $7,350. The disparity held across case types. Lawson's bonds for black defendants averaged 350% higher than for white defendants in identical circumstances. But that wasn't all. Jessica noticed something else in the data. Many of the black defendants who couldn't make bond had their cases dismissed due to failure to appear, because they were still in jail, unable to afford Lawson's inflated bonds. Their failure to appear was then used as evidence of their unreliability, justifying even higher bonds in future cases. It was a system designed to fail people. And it was working perfectly. Jessica created a spreadsheet, color-coding the disparities. She cross-referenced Lawson's bond decisions with income data, conviction rates, and case outcomes. Every number told the same story. This wasn't incompetence. This wasn't unconscious bias. This was systematic, intentional, and measurable discrimination. She printed out the analysis, added it to the growing file in her leather case. The case that would soon include 47 pages of documented civil rights violations. Lawson had set her bond at $10,000. He just priced his own career. Jessica checked into the Hampton Inn under her own name, carrying 2 file boxes and her laptop. She'd told her chambers she was taking a long weekend for personal matters. That was technically true. The hotel room became her war room. She spread documents across the desk, the bed, even the floor. Court transcripts on the left. Statistical analyses in the center. Witness statements on the right. Her leather notebook sat open, 3 weeks of meticulous observations waiting to be synthesized into something that could bring down a judge. Jessica started with the timeline, creating a minute-by-minute breakdown of each hearing. She noted every dismissive comment, every denied motion, every procedural violation. Then she cross-referenced them with audio recordings. She'd been quietly using her phone to record the public proceedings, which was entirely legal but something Lawson clearly hadn't considered. The statistical analysis took longer. She'd gathered data on 1,247 of Lawson's cases spanning 3 years. Using Excel and her own legal expertise, she documented patterns that would be impossible to explain as mere coincidence. Bond amounts, 350% higher for black defendants. Conviction rates, black defendants convicted at twice the rate of white defendants for identical charges. Sentence length, black defendants received sentences averaging 40% longer. Motion denials, black litigants had motions denied without review 73% of the time, compared to 12% for white litigants. But numbers alone wouldn't be enough. She needed human stories. Jessica had been watching the other litigants in Lawson's courtroom over the past 3 weeks. She'd quietly approached 7 of them, black defendants and plaintiffs who'd experienced similar treatment. She'd listened to their stories, documented their experiences, and asked them to write statements. There was Marcus Williams, who'd lost his house because Lawson had dismissed his motion to delay foreclosure without reading it. Sharon Bennett, whose custody hearing had lasted 7 minutes while a white mother's custody case had been heard for 3 hours. David Chen, who'd been told his English wasn't quite adequate for formal legal proceedings, despite being a third-generation American with a master's degree. The same pattern, over and over. Justice with 2 different standards. Jessica compiled everything into a comprehensive dossier, sworn statements, statistical analysis, audio evidence, procedural violations, and her own contemporaneous notes. 47 pages that told one story: Magistrate Brian Lawson was running a racist courtroom, and the system had protected him for years. She printed 3 copies. One for the Judicial Qualifications Commission. One for the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. One for her records. Then she made a phone call. "This is Judge Jessica Miller of the Federal Appeals Court. I need to schedule a formal complaint hearing regarding a state magistrate. Yes, I'll be testifying personally. And you'll want to bring the full commission. This is going to take a while." The Judicial Qualifications Commission hearing room was designed to be intimidating. Dark wood paneling, a raised bench where 7 commissioners sat in judgment, the seal of the state judiciary mounted on the wall like a warning. Jessica entered wearing her federal judicial robes for the first time in 3 weeks. The robes felt different now, heavier, weighted with the responsibility of what she'd learned. Magistrate Brian Lawson sat at the respondent's table with his attorney, looking annoyed but not worried. This was his world. These were his colleagues. He'd been through ethics complaints before, they always went away. The commission chair, Judge Martha Reynolds, called the hearing to order. "We're here regarding complaint number 2024, JQC, 487, filed by." She paused, reading the name. Her eyes widened slightly. "Filed by the Honorable Jessica Miller, Senior Judge, United States Court of Appeals." Lawson's head snapped up. The color drained from his face. Jessica stood. "May I approach, Madam Chair?" "Please." She walked to the bench, handed copies of her dossier to each commissioner, then turned to face the room. Lawson was staring at her, his mouth slightly open, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "For the record," Jessica began, her voice calm and clear, "I am Senior Judge Jessica Miller of the Federal Appeals Court, appointed in 1993, confirmed by the Senate, presiding over the Ninth Circuit. I've served on the federal bench for 32 years. She paused, letting that sink in. 3 weeks ago, I was named as defendant in a civil complaint that was assigned to Magistrate Lawson's courtroom. I made a deliberate choice to appear pro se, removing all markers of my judicial status. I wanted to experience the system as an ordinary citizen would. As an ordinary black woman would. The room was absolutely silent. What I experienced was a systematic pattern of racial discrimination, procedural violations, and civil rights abuses. The dossier before you contains 47 pages of documentation. Audio recordings of courtroom proceedings. Statistical analysis of 1,247 cases. Witness statements from other litigants. And my own contemporaneous notes. She turned to look directly at Lawson. Magistrate Lawson, you may not remember this, but 3 years ago, I served on the judicial selection panel that reviewed your application for appointment. I was the deciding vote. I signed the recommendation letter that put you on the bench. She pulled a paper from her folder, a copy of that original letter, with her signature clear at the bottom. I wrote that you demonstrated strong legal acumen and commitment to judicial integrity. I wrote that you would serve the bench with honor and bring credit to the judiciary. Jessica's voice hardened. I was wrong. You have brought disgrace to the entire judiciary. You have violated the civil rights of hundreds of people. You have used your position to perpetuate racism under the color of law. And you did it because you thought no one was watching. No one with power. She placed the letter on the commission chair's bench. I'm filing a formal recommendation that Magistrate Lawson be immediately removed from the bench and that this matter be referred to the Justice Department for criminal investigation. The evidence is contained in this dossier. I'm prepared to testify under oath to everything I witnessed. And I'm prepared to testify in any subsequent criminal proceedings. Jessica turned back to Lawson one final time. You laughed at me in your courtroom. You told me I should take a paralegal course. You assumed that because I was a black woman in an ordinary suit, I couldn't possibly understand the law. She smiled. Your Honor, I am the law. And the law is finally coming for you. 6 months later, Jessica sat in her chambers, morning sunlight streaming through the windows. The room smelled like coffee and old books, the familiar comfort of her real life. On her desk sat a newspaper. The headline read, Former Magistrate Lawson indicted on civil rights charges. Below it, a smaller story, Court Clerk Marcus Trent terminated following investigation. And on the back page, Officer Cole suspended pending federal review. The Justice Department Civil Rights Division had opened a full pattern and practice investigation. What they'd found went beyond even Jessica's documentation. Years of abuse. Hundreds of victims. A network of enablers who'd benefited from keeping the system exactly as it was. But that system was being dismantled now, one indictment at a time. Jessica's phone buzzed. Her clerk's voice came through the speaker. Judge Miller, the Judicial Selection Panel is ready for you in Conference Room B. Thank you. I'll be right there. Jessica stood, straightened her robes, and picked up a folder from her desk. Inside were 12 applications for the now vacant magistrate position in Briarwood County. She walked down the familiar corridor, her heels clicking against marble floors. When she entered the conference room, 5 other judges looked up from their papers. Shall we begin? Judge Reynolds asked. Jessica took her seat, opened the first application, and picked up her pen, the same pen she'd used to sign Brian Lawson's appointment letter, the same pen she'd used to document his crimes, the same pen that had ended his career. She read carefully, taking her time. Looking beyond the prestigious law schools and the impressive resumes. Looking for something else. Something harder to quantify but essential nonetheless. She was looking for integrity. For empathy. For someone who understood that justice wasn't just a word carved into courthouse walls, but a promise that had to be kept to everyone, especially those with the least power. This time, she was going to get it right. Her pen moved across the evaluation form, careful and deliberate, writing the future of justice in a county that desperately needed it. The scales were finally balanced. And Jessica Miller was still moving her pen.